Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Dave Bowden, the news editor here at Ballotpedia. Thursday is the one-year anniversary of the Supreme Court's ruling in Janus versus the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. Today we'll be discussing the decision and some ways that states are responding to it. We'll also talk about how the decision has impacted union membership and the complexities involved in determining those state-specific impacts. And finally, we'll discuss the methodology published just this morning that Ballotpedia will use to produce its own union membership data set. Joining me today is Cory Aquino, a managing editor here at Ballotpedia. Thanks for joining us, Cory.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so tell me about Janus. As I understand it, the Supreme Court found that public sector unions can't require the non-member employees they represent to pay agency fees covering the costs of non-political union activities. What are agency fees and how are they different from dues?
Sure. So agency fees, or they're sometimes referred to as fair share fees, cover things like collective bargaining, contract administration, and grievance arbitration. Dues, on the other hand, they're paid by full members and cover both the costs of the non-political activities that I just mentioned and political activities. Those political activities would include things like lobbying efforts, campaign contributions, and more.
So what arguments were being made by both sides in this case?
Opponents of the agency fee requirements argued that agency fees violated individual workers' First Amendment rights by compelling them to give financial support to an organization whose political activities they might not support. On the other hand, proponents of fee requirements argued that these fees were not used for political purposes and were necessary to support the costs associated with unions representing non-members.
Interesting. Okay, so what was the court's reasoning in the Janus decision?
So the majority found that compelling people to pay union fees of any kind violates their First Amendment free speech and associational rights. This overturned the court's precedent that was set in 1977 in a case called Abood versus the Detroit Board of Education. And in that case, the court had determined that it was not unconstitutional to require employees to pay fees to a union as long as those fees were not used to finance political activities. In Janus, the court ruled 5-4, splitting along what some would say were ideological lines. Samuel Alito penned the majority opinion, and he was joined by Justices Roberts, Kennedy, Thomas, and Gorsuch. Justices Ginsburg, Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan dissented in the case.
The decision was issued 1 year ago tomorrow, June 27th. Have states reacted to this ruling? What kinds of legislative activity did we see in response last year?
Yeah, so some states tackled Janus in a preemptive fashion, taking action before the decision was even reached. New Jersey is an example of that. In May of last year, so again, before the decision, New Jersey enacted an omnibus bill that requires public employers to provide unions with access to employees and employee information. But then in the immediate aftermath of Janus, between the decision date last year, today, and December 31st, lawmakers in Massachusetts, Michigan, Missouri, and Pennsylvania took up 7 bills related to public sector unions. That's a pretty modest total, but it's mostly due to the fact that most legislatures had adjourned by the time the Janus decision came down last year.
Okay, what about this year? I understand we've seen quite a bit of legislative activity so far. There have been, by Ballotpedia's count, 101 bills introduced across some 31 different states. Have some states seen more activity than others?
Yeah, Oregon has seen the most, with 10 relevant bills introduced so far this year. Pennsylvania and Washington aren't far behind with 9 and 8, respectively.
So of these 101 bills, 51 have been sponsored by Democrats, 38 by Republicans, and the rest by either committees or bipartisan groups of lawmakers. What can we discern from that? For example, is there a common thread regarding this proposed legislation?
Yeah, broadly, the bills that are sponsored by Democrats can be understood as attempts to counteract Janus by implementing policies that favor unions. On the other hand, bills sponsored by Republicans aim to codify in state statutes the findings of the Janus decision.
All right, so have any of these 101 bills been enacted into law?
Yep, five public sector union bills have become law. one each in Delaware, Nevada, and Washington, and then 2 in Oregon. All of these states are Democratic trifectas too, meaning that in each case, the Democrats control both chambers of the legislature and the governorship. The most interesting bill is the one out of Washington State, which was enacted in April of this year. It relates most directly to the Janus ruling and establishes that public sector employers and unions can't be held liable for any legal claims involving agency fees that were paid prior to the Janus decision. That's noteworthy because in the year since Janus, we've seen several lawsuits seeking refunds of agency fees. The Washington bill also repeals state statutes requiring employees either to join unions or pay fees to unions as a condition of employment, which was a direct consequence of Janus.
Yeah, that's an interesting law. What about the other bills that have been enacted? What do they do?
Yeah, so the Delaware bill requires that compensation be treated as a required subject during contract negotiations, and that's pretty narrow in its design. The Nevada bill is broader and grants collective bargaining rights to state employees. And the 2 bills in Oregon together require public employers to grant paid time to employees that are participating in select union activities and to provide unions with access to new employees.
That's a great discussion of the legislative responses. Let's move on to Janus's impact on unions. Have public sector unions seen a change in membership since the ruling was issued?
That's an important question, and it's difficult to answer conclusively. People kind of pitch different sides. So groups that support the Janus ruling tend to point to figures that suggest declines in public sector union membership. Unions, meanwhile, tend to promote figures that suggest a minimal impact on their membership.
What are some of the different ways to approach this question?
Yeah, so one thing we can do that's pretty easy is look at the largest public sector unions and see whether they specifically have experienced a net increase or decrease in members from 2017 to 2018. If we take the two most prominent public sector unions in the country, the National Education Association and, again, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. Together, these 2 unions represent about 4.3 million public sector workers, which is equal to around 20% of the nation's total public sector workforce. So according to federal reports, total NEA membership in 2017 was about 3.1 million. That included 3 million dues-paying members and just under 100,000 agency fee payers. In 2018, so a year later, I'll have a caveat to that in a second, membership was about 3 million, all dues-paying members. So that's a net decrease of around 2.4%. The caveat here is that the most recent reporting period extends just 2 months after the Janus decision. So at least for the NEA, subsequent reports will give us a much clearer picture of NEA membership in the post-Janus period.
All right, that's an interesting look at the NEA. What about the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees?
Hey, I'm sorry, Dave. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, I had a little stutter there. On to the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. So in 2017, their total membership was about 1.4 million. That was around 1.3 million dues-paying members and a little more than 100,000 agency fee payers. In 2018, a year later, their total membership had decreased to about 1.3 million, nearly all of whom were dues-paying members. So that's a net decrease of about 6%. This is all interesting data, but it's far from conclusive. We're looking at just a very limited sample of the total public sector workforce, and the figures apply only to a relatively brief window of time after the Janus decision.
All right, that's a really interesting look at the membership of those two unions, especially. From what I've been reading, news outlets, think tanks, unions, advocacy groups, they all seem to have different assessments of how the Janus decision has impacted membership. For instance, I read that Jarrett Skorup, in an article from the Mackinac Center, notes that there were decreases in public sector union membership in several states without right-to-work laws, including California, New Jersey, and Michigan. But he notes that it's unclear how much of that decline is due to Janus. Meanwhile, Daniel DeSalvo, who is an assistant professor of political science at the City College of New York, draws a somewhat different conclusion. He wrote in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that nationwide public sector union membership decreased less than 1% from 2017 to 2018. And DeSalvo characterizes that as a nominal decline. What accounts for this diversity of opinion?
So there are three main complicating factors when it comes to evaluating the impact of the Janus decision. One, there is little existing research on union membership. Two, there are no uniform federal reporting requirements on union membership. And three, the union's organizational hierarchies themselves can complicate counting efforts.
All right, let's break them down. Let's start with the first one. Judging by the articles I mentioned above, there's at least some information available on this topic. Can you tell me a bit more about the existing research?
Sure, there's some, but there isn't any that presents comparable membership and financial data for all 50 states. The most frequently cited sources base their figures on the current population survey, which is a sample survey of about 60,000 households. These data sets are estimates, not precise measurements, and so they should be taken with a grain of salt. And other existing work generally deals with states in isolation, so it's difficult to compare states to each other because of differing methodologies used.
You said there are no uniform federal reporting requirements for public sector unions, but earlier in our discussion, you cited some federal reports for both the NEA and the AFSCME in terms of their membership figures. Why do some unions produce reports but not others?
So there's some federal requirement. So under federal law, unions that represent public sector employees only are not required to file financial reports with the U.S. Department of Labor. Public sector unions that also represent some private sector employees are subject to reporting requirements. And for these unions, the federal reports are the best sources for membership and financial data. It's the unions that represent public sector employees only where the federal reports are non-existent.
Okay. All right, that makes sense now. All right, what about that third factor, the organizational complexities that make it so difficult to chart union membership?
Sure, a lot of unions are organized at local levels, and then those local unions often belong to state associations, which in turn belong to national level organizations. So a local school district teachers union might belong to a state level affiliate of the National Education Association. So any attempt to count members, you have to take this fact into account or you risk double counting the members. And further, there isn't even a comprehensive list of all of the public sector unions to begin with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so the discussion of those three factors makes the difficulties much more clear. I understand that just this morning, Ballotpedia published a methodology that describes how we are going to try to navigate these complexities and produce our own membership data set. Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. So we want to come up with a more concrete and comprehensive data set than any that's currently available. And to do that, we're going to identify a list of the most prominent public sector unions in each state based on media reports, consultation with experts on the ground, and our own research efforts.
So really a state-by-state approach.
Yep. We'll use a number of sources to collect data on each union, including membership totals. Where possible, we'll use the federal financial reports and IRS filings. In the cases where we don't have those, we'll turn to state-level disclosures, media reports, and the unions themselves. And we'll look beyond just membership totals to a number of data points. For example, we'll also be collecting data on union revenues, expenditures, and political spending. Given all of the challenges I described earlier, though, we expect there to be some gaps in the information. There will be some prominent unions for which we can't determine precise membership figures. But nonetheless, once we've finished our work, we'll have put together a really unique data set that is not based on extrapolations. And so as a result is more precise and in fact more conservative. We don't have a risk of overstating our claims. We'll also be well positioned to track changes over time because we're dealing with a discrete set of unions. So we'll be able to collect information on the same data points from one year to the next.
That sounds like a very ambitious, but also very important project. Is there any chance you can share some of your preliminary findings?
Yeah, sure. So we can take a closer look at three states, California and Connecticut. They're both states with a strong union presence. And then Alabama, which is a right-to-work state. In all three, you can see that the teachers' unions, particularly the NEA affiliates, are very prominent. That's illustrated by membership figures where it's available, as well as data points on revenue and expenditures.
This is great. Let's start with California then.
Yeah, sure. So on the slide that you all can see, in California, we've identified the unions listed in the table there as the state's most prominent. These unions together represent, at a minimum, 811,000 public sector employees. In the table, the column for total members are dues-paying union members. Agency fee payers are identified only when that number can be obtained via federal disclosure reports. And then a figure is listed under total represented when our source doesn't specify whether the figure applies only to dues-paying members or all members of a collective bargaining unit. So now we can look at some financial data. The three largest unions by membership, the California Teachers Association, the California Federation of Teachers, and the California School Employees Association, had combined revenues of $295.6 million and combined total expenditures of $257.9 million. For the other three, IRS filings couldn't be located.
How does all of this information compare then with Connecticut, for example?
Yeah, sure. So the next slide on Connecticut, the ones you see before you are what we've identified as the state's most prominent public sector unions. Altogether, they represent, at a minimum, about 123,000 public sector employees. Combined revenues were $42.7 million, and combined expenditures were $42.9 million.
All right, so we've taken a look at California and Connecticut. Then how do those two states compare with Alabama?
So again, what you see in front of you on the slide are what we've identified as the most prominent public sector unions in Alabama. But as you can see, we've not yet been able to track down precise membership figures for what we think are three of the largest of these unions. Our experience up to this point suggests that it may be more difficult to come up with membership figures in right-to-work states like Alabama, though of course we're still pursuing leads on this information. So we can look at revenues and expenditures, and combined revenues for three of these unions, the Alabama Education Association, AFT Alabama, and the Alabama State Employees Association, were about $18 million, and combined expenditures were $17.3 million.
Okay, this is all great stuff and a lot of detailed analysis. How then do these three states compare when it comes to campaign spending, political campaign spending?
Yeah, so on political campaign spending specifically, the Campaign Finance Institute maintains a database of campaign spending at the federal, state, and local levels. So of the three states we've been discussing today, public sector unions in California had the most campaign spending in 2018. That was about $74 million and about 29% of the national total. That's not particularly surprising considering its population and the relative prominence of public sector unions in state affairs there. In Connecticut, on the other hand, political spending was just $21,000. That may be surprising, but it can be attributed in significant part to the state's relatively small population and political cohesiveness. In Alabama, spending was about $2.2 million, and more than $2 million of that came from the Alabama Education Association.
Well, this is a ton of fascinating data here, Cory. When will the complete data set for all 50 states become available?
We will have, we'll be working hard on this and have the full data set published by the end of the summer.
I'll be looking forward to it, as I'm sure everybody else will be. Thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Yeah, I was happy to.
All right. I hope you enjoyed this discussion of the Janus decision and how certain states have responded to it in the past year, as well as the work that we're doing to analyze public sector union membership. This is a really fascinating topic, and if you like this webinar and want to learn more, we invite you to subscribe to Union Station, which is a free weekly newsletter on public sector union policy. Just go to our website and search for the term Union Station to see prior issues and to sign up. And if you have any questions that weren't answered in the discussion today, feel free to send an email to editor@ballotpedia.org, and we'll try to get an answer for those to you. Changing gears, just a reminder that the first set of Democratic presidential debates takes place tonight and tomorrow night. We have a free daily newsletter, the Daily Presidential News Briefing, to help you follow all the news right up through the 2020 election. And please continue to visit ballotpedia.org for updates on all the news about politics. We invite you to keep in the know with our email newsletters, including the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday, and our weekly newsletter, The Tap. Thanks again, Cory, and thank you all for joining us.